The best part about watching my director freeze up during that board presentation wasn't the job offer, though $295,000 a year definitely didn't hurt. It wasn't even watching her try to explain to the CEO why 4 of our biggest municipal clients had gone quiet in the span of 3 weeks. The best part was knowing she'd handed me the exit herself, and done it in front of 42 people, when she stood up in that conference room and told the room my 2 years of field engineering work was amateur analysis that doesn't meet professional standards. My name is Victor Hale. I'm 51 years old. I've been doing civil and infrastructure engineering since I was 26, and for most of that time, I've worked in the field. Actual job sites, actual problems, actual dirt on my boots. When my director decided to publicly humiliate me in front of the entire project division last March, she thought she was ending something. She was actually starting something. But I need to give you the full picture, because without it, the ending doesn't hit the way it should. I joined Meridian Infrastructure Group about 2.5 years ago. They do civil and municipal engineering work, water treatment systems, drainage networks, roadway reconstruction, utility corridor projects. The kind of work that doesn't sound glamorous until you realize that when it goes wrong, entire neighborhoods flood or a city's drinking water gets contaminated. I'd spent the previous 12 years at a mid-sized firm in Columbus doing similar work, but Meridian was bigger, had more complex projects, and honestly, I was ready for a new challenge. What I didn't fully appreciate until my first week was that Meridian had recently brought in a new director of project delivery. Her name was Sylvia Marsh, and she'd come straight from a large management consulting background, MBA from a top 10 school, impressive credentials on paper, 0 time ever spent managing an actual infrastructure project in the field. Her entire professional philosophy was built around standardized templates, milestone dashboards, and what she called repeatable delivery frameworks. I heard her use that phrase in our first department meeting, and I remember thinking, okay, let's see how that plays with a water main replacement project where the soil conditions change every 50 feet. To be fair, I went in with an open mind. Different backgrounds can complement each other. I'd worked under project executives before who didn't know the technical side and still ran good operations. But Sylvia wasn't interested in complementing field expertise. She wanted to replace it with process. Our first real friction came about 3 months in. I was assigned to a project for the city of Harrowfield, a mid-sized municipality about 40 miles outside Cincinnati. They needed a full assessment and redesign of their stormwater drainage network. The system was aging out, causing basement flooding in residential areas during heavy rain events, and the city had been getting complaints and liability claims for years. Sylvia's plan was straightforward: use our standard municipal drainage assessment template, produce a report in 3 weeks, hand it off to design, done. I drove out to Harrowfield on my own time before the engagement officially started, just to look around, talk to a few residents, drove the streets, walked a couple of the drainage corridors on foot. What I found was that the flooding problem wasn't primarily the pipe capacity. It was that the outlet structures at 3 key points along the main drainage channel were partially blocked by decades of sediment and root intrusion, and the channel itself had degraded to the point where it was actually slowing water flow rather than moving it. Fix the pipes all you want. If the outlet's choked, you're going to keep flooding those neighborhoods. I brought this to Sylvia and asked for 2 extra weeks to do a proper field assessment of the channel system before we submitted any design recommendations. She looked at me the way people look at you when you said something mildly ridiculous. The template addresses outlet structures, she said. That's covered in Section 4. We're not modifying the project scope based on a preliminary site visit. I tried a different angle. The city's been dealing with this for 11 years and spent about $800,000 on fixes that didn't work. If we submit another report that misses the root cause, we're going to be the 4th engineering firm they fire. That got her attention. She gave me 1 extra week. I spent that week in Harrowfield and Waders, physically walking the drainage channel with a city maintenance crew, logging blockage locations, taking flow measurements, mapping sediment deposits. It wasn't glamorous work. At one point, I was standing knee-deep in stagnant water in August heat pulling root material out of a corrugated metal outlet pipe, with a utility crew supervisor named Doug who'd worked for the city for 19 years and knew every inch of that system by memory. Doug told me they'd tried to flag the outlet problem to the last 2 engineering firms and been told it was outside project scope. The final assessment we produced was specific, field verified, and directly addressed the actual failure points. Hale approved it without a single revision request, which, in municipal engineering, basically never happens. They authorized a phased remediation plan totaling $2.4 million in engineering and construction services over 3 years. Our cut of that was significant. They also sent a letter to Meridian's CEO praising the quality of the assessment. Sylvia's response when I presented the results was to note in writing that I had exceeded the allocated project hours by 60% and that my unilateral scope modifications represented a project management concern. I looked at the write-up, looked at the Hale letter sitting right next to it on the conference table, and said, "We just secured a $2.4 million engagement because I spent an extra week in the field. That seems like a reasonable trade. We can't build a scalable delivery model on individual engineers making scope decisions without authorization," she replied. "That's not how professional services operate at scale." I should have understood what I was dealing with right then. The second situation came about 6 months later. One of our longer-standing clients, a regional water authority that managed drinking water systems for about 180,000 people across 4 counties, had been having recurring issues with pressure loss and discoloration events in one section of their distribution network. They'd already had 2 other firms look at it. Both had recommended pipe replacement in the affected zone. The water authority had spent $600,000 on partial replacement already, and the problems persisted. Their operations manager called me directly. We'd worked together on a small project the year before, and she trusted me. She said she was running out of patience and out of explanations to give the county commissioners. I reviewed everything that had been done, talked to their system operators, and drove out to look at the network layout myself. The replacement work had been done correctly. The problem was something the previous firms hadn't caught because they'd looked at the distribution pipes and stopped there. The actual source of pressure irregularity was a pressure-reducing valve station that had been installed in the 1990s and had been operating partially out of spec for years. Nobody had ever identified it because it was buried in a utility vault that was technically on a different maintenance schedule than the distribution network itself. The discoloration events were coming from a dead-end section of the old network that had never been properly flushed after the replacement work. 2 separate issues, both fixable, neither involving more pipe replacement. I wrote it up, made my recommendations, presented it to the water authority. They implemented the fixes. Pressure problems resolved in 2 weeks. Discoloration events stopped. Their operations manager sent me a personal email saying it was the first time in 3 years she'd felt like she was actually getting engineering help instead of just engineering reports. The water authority expanded their annual service agreement with Meridian by $340,000 and specifically requested that I be the lead engineer on their account. Sylvia documented that I had engaged with a client outside the formally assigned project team structure and made field recommendations without routing them through her approval process. I went to her office and closed the door behind me. I just solved a problem that 2 other firms couldn't solve and turned a frustrated client into an expanded account, I said. I'd like to understand what part of that is a performance concern. She was patient about explaining it, which was almost worse. The issue isn't the outcome, she said. The issue is methodology. If every engineer on this team operates independently based on their own judgment about what clients need, we can't ensure consistent quality or manage liability exposure. We need engineers working within defined process boundaries. So the process boundary is more important than solving the client's problem. The process boundary exists to protect the client and the firm, she said. That's what professionalism looks like at scale. I thought about Doug in the drainage channel. I thought about the water authority operations manager who'd been getting inadequate engineering help for 3 years. I didn't say anything else. I walked out. The third situation happened about 4 months before everything fell apart. Meridian had been trying to break into a larger municipal market. Specifically, city-level infrastructure projects in the $5 million to $15 million range. We had the technical capacity, but we'd lost 2 consecutive RFP competitions to larger firms. Sylvia's approach to the problem was to invest in better proposal templates and graphics. I had a different read on it. We were losing because our proposals read like every other mid-size engineering firm's proposals, technically competent, process-oriented, full of methodology descriptions and team credential bios. Light on any actual indication that we understood the specific challenges of the specific municipality we were pitching to. I spent 8 weeks on my own time doing something Sylvia had explicitly said wasn't part of my job. I researched 3 target municipalities in depth, their infrastructure histories, their past project failures, their current capital improvement plans, their political dynamics around public work spending. I told to people who knew these cities. I drove out and looked at the infrastructure myself in 2 of the 3 cases. Then I drafted what I called client-specific positioning briefs, detailed documents that weren't proposals yet, just deep context analysis of what each municipality actually needed and where our capabilities specifically matched those needs. When the next RFP opportunity came up, a $7.2 million roadway and utility reconstruction project for the city of Belmore, I used my brief to shape our entire proposal approach. Instead of leading with our credentials and methodology, we led with a specific analysis of Belmore's corridor history, the patterns in their previous project overruns, and exactly how our approach addressed those specific failure modes. We won the Belmore project. It was the largest single contract Meridian had secured in 4 years. The city's public works director called our CEO to specifically praise the proposal quality, saying it was the first time a firm had demonstrated they'd actually studied Belmore's situation rather than submitting a generic engineering proposal. Our CEO, a man named Douglas Fenn, mentioned it in a company-wide email. "This is what differentiated technical delivery looks like," he wrote. "We need more of this." I watched Sylvia read that email from across the open office. I watched her jaw tighten slightly. 2 weeks later, she told me she was launching a comprehensive review of project documentation practices across the engineering team, and that she needed me to compile all of my project files, field notes, client correspondence, and methodology documentation from the past 2 years into a unified archive for review. She wanted it in a centralized shared drive folder she controlled access to. I understood the intent. This was an audit designed to find procedural violations, all the scope modifications, the unsanctioned client contact, the time spent on work that didn't fit neatly into her delivery framework. She was building a case. I spent 3 weeks pulling everything together. Every field assessment, every client communication, every methodology note, every outcome metric. When I finished, the archive ran to over 200 files across 14 project folders. It was thorough because I'd been thorough. Every hour I'd spent outside of her defined process boundaries was documented alongside the specific outcome it had produced. Harrowfield's $2.4 million engagement. The Water Authority's expanded contract. The Belmore win. Dozens of smaller client interactions that had retained relationships that otherwise might have walked. I put everything in the shared folder she'd specified. I kept a complete personal backup on my own external drive, as I do with all my work. That detail matters for what came next. Sylvia scheduled a division-wide project review meeting for a Thursday in late March. She told us it would cover delivery methodology and quality standards. 42 people were in that conference room. Engineers, project managers, administrative staff, a few junior associates. Douglas Fenn was there too, which I thought was unusual for a methodology meeting. She started by presenting what she framed as a practice assessment. She pulled up the shared drive archive, my archive, on the main conference room display, and began walking through it. I could see immediately this wasn't a quality review. She was using my documentation as exhibit material for a case she'd already built. Every extended field engagement was framed as unauthorized scope creep. Every client interaction outside the formal project team was framed as a liability exposure. Every hour I'd logged beyond her project allocations was presented as evidence of resource mismanagement. She was using the most thorough documentation of client success I'd ever produced and turning it into a disciplinary exhibit. I kept my face neutral. I'd been in difficult professional situations before. I know how to wait. Then she did something I genuinely did not anticipate. She told the room that the documentation represented a methodology the Meridian needed to formally move away from. She said it created unrealistic client expectations and introduced uncontrolled risk into the delivery process. And then, she said, going forward, this entire approach is being retired. And she deleted the archive folder from the shared drive while 42 people watched. The room went quiet in a particular way that I've only experienced a few times in my career. Not the quiet of discomfort or awkwardness, the quiet of people watching something cross a line. I felt my phone vibrate in my jacket pocket. I looked at the screen under the conference table. The caller ID showed Apex Civil Partners, a firm I knew well. They'd been doing strong work in the infrastructure consulting space for about 3 years. built by two former colleagues of mine who'd left a national firm to start something more technical and less templated. I'd had coffee with one of the founders, a man named Curtis Webb, about 8 months earlier, and we talked for 2 hours about what differentiated technical delivery actually looked like in practice. I excused myself quietly and stepped into the hallway. "Victor," Curtis said, "I heard you might be having an interesting morning." I asked how he knew. "Because someone in that room texted one of our mutual contacts about 3 minutes ago," he said. "And because we've been thinking about calling you for about 6 months, we just didn't want to poach you while things were going well." What followed was a 15-minute conversation that rearranged my immediate future. Apex Civil Partners wanted to build out a dedicated municipal infrastructure practice. They had the client relationships and the reputation, but they needed a senior engineer who could lead complex field-intensive engagements, develop the technical methodology, and help them compete for larger city-level contracts. Curtis made me an offer, $295,000 base with partnership track, full autonomy over technical practice development, and profit participation once the municipal division hit its targets. My current salary was $162,000. I thanked Curtis, told him I'd call him back within the hour, and walked back into the conference room. Sylvia had moved on to presenting her new standardized delivery protocols. She paused when I came back in and looked at me with an expression that was trying to be neutral and wasn't quite managing it. "Do you have questions about the new framework, Victor?" I looked around the room. I looked at the blank space on the conference display where 2 years of work had been. I looked at Douglas Fenn, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't fully read. "Actually," I said, "I have something to tell everyone." Sylvia blinked. That wasn't in her script. "I'm resigning from Meridian. Effective immediately. I'll be joining Apex Civil Partners as Director of Municipal Infrastructure." The room did that quiet thing again. Sylvia recovered first. "You can't resign in the middle of a department meeting. There are notice obligations, transition protocols. My employment agreement specifies that immediate resignation is permitted in response to documented hostile work conditions," I said. I was calm. I'd read that agreement 3 times in the past week, having my professional work publicly destroyed in front of colleagues' qualifiers. Douglas Fenn stood up slowly. "Victor, let's step out and discuss this before." "I appreciate that," I said. "But I think we're past private discussions. You were in the room." I picked up my folio, shook a few hands near me, people I'd worked with and genuinely liked, and walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard Sylvia say something to Douglas in a low voice, something with the word contract in it. I turned back once. "I kept personal backups of all my project work, Sylvia. The methodology lives whether or not it's in your shared drive." I was in my car 14 minutes later. The next 3 weeks were a kind of professional vertigo I wasn't prepared for. Not the bad kind. The kind where things move faster than your expectations can keep up with. I hadn't contacted any Meridian clients. I didn't reach out to anyone. I updated my LinkedIn profile with my new title at Apex Civil Partners and left it at that. The first call came on a Monday morning, 4 days after I'd left. It was the operations manager from the Water Authority. She said she'd heard through a colleague that I'd moved firms and she wanted to understand what that meant for their account. We talked for 90 minutes. By the end of the call, she'd asked me to arrange a meeting between her leadership team and the principals at Apex Civil Partners to discuss what a continued relationship might look like. The call from Harrowfield came the following Wednesday. The city's public works director heard from someone at the Water Authority. He said the ongoing phases of the drainage remediation project were coming up for bid, and he wanted to know if Apex would be submitting. I told him we would be very interested. By the end of my 3rd week at Apex, 5 former Meridian clients had reached out. Not because I'd solicited them. Because in municipal infrastructure, reputation travels. People talk to each other at regional water conferences and Public Works Association meetings and county commissioner briefings. When you solve problems that other firms couldn't solve, that information lives in the professional network long after the project files are closed. Curtis told me at the end of that 3rd week that the inquiry volume from my former client base had accelerated their timeline for formally launching the Municipal Infrastructure Division by about a year. Meanwhile, I was hearing through people we both knew what was happening at Meridian. The Harrowfield project's second phase, the channel remediation work I designed and had been managing the client relationship on, had stalled when the city asked technical questions that the Meridian team couldn't answer without pulling someone in who understood the field assessment. The Water Authority had formally notified Meridian that they were putting their service agreement out for competitive bid. Belmore had asked, through a back channel, whether Victor Hale was still associated with Meridian before committing to the construction phase of their project. Douglas Fenn, from what I understood, had asked Sylvia to explain the client situation at a leadership meeting about 5 weeks after I left. The explanation hadn't apparently gone well. Sylvia left Meridian about 4 months after I did. The circumstances weren't fully public, but the outline was clear enough. 3 major clients had either left or significantly reduced their engagement. The Belmore project had required urgent staffing adjustments, and the board had questions about the direction of the project delivery group. She wasn't asked back after her contract term ended. I heard this from a former colleague over lunch, and my honest reaction was less satisfaction than I might have expected. I wasn't glad she'd failed. I was glad that the failure had a clear and logical source, and that the logic was visible enough that everyone involved could see it. That's different from revenge. Revenge is something you do. This was something that happened because of decisions she made, starting with the decision to build a management philosophy on controlling process rather than delivering results. What I tell the junior engineers I work with now, and I work with a good group of them at Apex, people who are genuinely excited about the technical side of infrastructure, is that your reputation in this field is built on something slower and more durable than any single project outcome. It's built on whether your clients can call you at 7 in the morning when something isn't right, and whether you'll get in your car and go look at it. It's built on whether the maintenance crew supervisor, who's been doing this for 19 years, trusts that you're actually listening to him. It's built on whether the public works director feels like you understood his city's specific situation or just submitted a generic set of slides with his city's name on the cover. No shared drive folder contains that. No efficiency dashboard measures it. And no one can delete it. When someone tries to erase what you've built, they're not erasing your work. They're erasing their own access to what your work produced. Those are very different things. And the difference tends to become apparent fairly quickly once the clients start making their own decisions about who they want to work with. 2 years in at Apex Civil Partners, the municipal infrastructure division I built has 15 engineers and a project portfolio that's grown from 0 to about $28 million in active engagements. Harrowfield is in the 3rd phase of a remediation program that's reduced their flood-related liability claims by over 70%. The Water Authority signed a 5-year comprehensive services agreement. Belmore hired us for 2 additional corridor projects after the first one came in on time and under budget. I still wear steel dirt boots to client sites. I still think the most important engineering tool I own is the ability to stand next to someone who's been doing a job for 20 years. And actually listen to what they're telling me about why it isn't working. Some things can't be standardized. In infrastructure, that's not a bug in the system. That's the whole job. I've had a lot of time to think about what really happened in that conference room. Not just the obvious part, the deleted files, the resignation, the phone call, the part underneath it. Sylvia wasn't a bad person. I've come to believe that genuinely, she was a person who had built an identity around a particular idea of what professional success looked like, and that idea required everything to be controllable, measurable, repeatable. When I kept producing results that didn't fit inside her framework, it didn't just inconvenience her, it threatened the entire logic she'd organized her career around. That's a frightening thing to have sitting in your department. I think the delete button was less about punishing me and more about reasserting a reality she needed to be true. The problem is that reality doesn't negotiate. Every choice in that story had a consequence that followed from it as naturally as water finding a drain. When Sylvia chose process over results, she created the conditions where clients who needed results would eventually look elsewhere. When she deleted that archive, she didn't erase the work. She confirmed, in front of 42 witnesses, including her own CEO, that she valued her framework more than the outcomes her team was producing. When Douglas Fenn watched that happen and didn't intervene in the moment, he made a decision too, one that became harder to walk back once the client call started. And when I walked out of that building, I didn't do it to win anything. I did it because staying would have required me to become someone who produces worse work on purpose to fit inside a smaller definition of good. I wasn't willing to do that. The $295,000 offer was real, and I won't pretend it didn't matter. But what mattered more was the clarity. Finally working somewhere that the question, does this solve the client's actual problem, was the only metric that counted. What I keep coming back to is something I saw clearly only in hindsight. The field work was never really about the field work. Walking drainage channels, riding with warehouse crews, talking to maintenance supervisors who've been doing the same job for 19 years. All of that was an expression of something more basic, a belief that the person closest to the problem usually understands it better than the person farthest from it. That expertise isn't a credential you hang on a wall, it's a practice. You maintain it by staying curious, staying humble, and staying willing to stand in uncomfortable places to understand what's actually happening. Sylvia's framework produced people who were very good at delivering reports. My approach produced people who were good at solving problems. In the short term, the distinction isn't always visible. Over 18 months, it shows up in whether your clients renew their contracts or go quiet. I think about Doug sometimes, the city maintenance supervisor in Harrowfield who'd been trying to tell engineering firms about that outlet blockage for years and kept being told it was outside project scope. He knew the answer. He just needed someone to show up and listen to him. It's not a complicated idea. It just requires a certain kind of discipline to actually practice it, especially when the easier path is to submit the template report and move on. That discipline, showing up, listening, doing the harder thing when the harder thing is the right thing, doesn't come from ambition. It comes from caring more about whether the work actually works than about whether it looks right on a dashboard. You can't fake that over time. People feel it, clients feel it, and eventually, the professional world around you tends to reflect it back. That's the only real lesson I have to offer. Not every story ends the way mine did, but the choice to do the work honestly, completely, with genuine attention to what the problem actually is, that choice tends to produce a certain kind of professional life. One where you can stand behind what you've built, one where the people you've helped remember you, not because you were efficient, but because you actually helped. I'm still wearing steel-toed boots to client sites. I plan to keep doing that for as long as they'll let me.